Christmas market of St. Mary Mead had reached its apex. Coloured lights reflected in puddles of frozen water, and the aroma of mulled wine and roasted chestnuts drifted between wooden stalls adorned with golden garlands. It was the afternoon of December 21st, 3 days before Christmas, and most of the village inhabitants had ventured out to complete their last-minute shopping and enjoy the festive atmosphere that transformed the small public park into something magical. Miss Marple was seated in a wooden chair beside the Church Women's Association tea stall, a fine porcelain cup in her trembling hands. At 87 years old, her blue-grey eyes could see less than she wished, but her capacity for observation had improved with age, as if nature had compensated for physical weakness with an almost supernatural mental acuity. She watched people pass, young mothers pulling children towards sweet vendors, elderly men laughing as they examined hand-blown glass ornaments, middle-aged couples buying scented candles for their homes. "How beautiful Christmas is," murmured Miss Harrow, who sold beside her, offering bags of homemade biscuits. "Though, of course, one always expects something unpleasant to happen. It's never as simple as it ought to be." Miss Marple smiled with that expression of mild tolerance she reserved for those who underestimated her understanding of the world. "Oh, quite true. As my dear cousin Arthur once said, holidays bring out both the best and worst in people. All our secrets, our unresolved tensions, they emerge when we least expect them." The most striking stall at the market, however, was the one run by Eleanor Fairfax. It was called the Corner of Christmas Wishes, and was not, in any sense, a typical stall. Eleanor did not sell sweets or ornaments, but something far more intriguing: personalized Christmas cards, leather-bound journals, and above all, what she called life consultations, brief sessions where, for a surprisingly generous sum, she would listen to people's problems and offer what she termed practical wisdom disguised as friendship. Eleanor Fairfax was a woman of 52, well-preserved, with dark brown hair always impeccably waved, and brown eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of those who approached her. She had arrived in St. Mary Mead only 18 months ago, purchasing a lovely stone cottage on the village outskirts, claiming she sought retirement from an agitated business life in London. She had quickly become a fascinating figure in the community, sophisticated without being dismissive, kind without being overly familiar. What no one in St. Mary Mead knew precisely was how Eleanor Fairfax seemed to know everyone's deepest secrets. Not in a malicious way, never quite that. She simply knew. She knew that Mrs. Pritchard had borne an illegitimate son 30 years ago. She knew the vicar had been in a romantic relationship with his bishop in less tolerant times. She knew that young Charles Bennet had forged his university credentials, and somehow this information simply arose in casual conversations, never as malicious gossip, but always as part of some broader reflection on human nature. That Tuesday afternoon, as Miss Marple watched from her tea stall, she saw a succession of people visit Eleanor Fairfax discreetly. First came Mrs. Catherine Ashford, wife of the local doctor, who entered the stall with a forced smile and left 20 minutes later with reddened eyes. Then came James Willoughby, the local solicitor, who normally exuded confidence but seemed nervous as he spoke with Eleanor in low tones. Finally came David Sutherland, the young headmaster of the local school, who had been in the village only 2 years. Miss Marple noted particularly David's reaction. When he emerged from Eleanor's stall after a session of less than 30 minutes, his face was pale, almost grey. His hands trembled slightly as he adjusted his dark overcoat. And when he passed in front of Miss Marple's tea stall, she saw something few in the village would have detected. A mixture of absolute anger and something that seemed dangerously close to fear. "That young man seems to be under considerable pressure," observed Miss Marple quietly to Miss Harrow. "Oh, young people are always under pressure," replied Miss Harrow with the indifference of someone who has never experienced genuine doubt. "Though I must say, Eleanor Fairfax seems to have a way of intensifying these matters. I've heard that after speaking with her, some people behave in quite extraordinary ways." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea. It was still warmer than she preferred, but she drank it patiently, observing. Her mind worked through the patterns she saw, not the obvious patterns others would notice, but the subtler ones. The way Eleanor Fairfax tilted her head. The manner in which her eyes followed people even after they'd gone. And the expression on David Sutherland's face, that which she recognized from many years ago, when her cousin Henry discovered his business partner had been stealing from him for 15 years. It was the expression of someone whose world had just been turned upside down. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as the winter sun began its descent toward the horizon, and the market filled even more with people desperate to complete final purchases, something occurred that changed everything. A young woman, no more than 30, rushed to Eleanor's stall. It was Margaret Sutherland, David's wife. Her face was contorted with anguish, and when she spotted her husband speaking with one of the other vendors, she ran to him and gripped his arm. "David," she said, her voice barely audible above the market noise, "we must talk, now, at home." From where she sat, Miss Marple could not hear the exact words, but she saw the exchange of glances between David and Margaret. She saw how David paled even further, and she saw how Margaret, tears running down her cheeks, practically dragged her husband away from the market. Eleanor Fairfax from her stall observed it all with an expression that might have been genuine concern or, thought Miss Marple with a flutter of intrigue, something rather more calculated. The festivity continued. Lights flickered. Families laughed. The village band began playing carols in the centre of the park. And Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to recognize the first tremors of an approaching storm, wondered silently what secret was terrible enough to make a young man appear as though his entire life had just crumbled away. It was just as the church clock struck 6 that it happened. A piercing scream cut through the festive atmosphere, the sort of scream that belongs to someone who has seen something their mind refuses to process. It originated from the edges of the market, near the dark trees surrounding the park, where stalls were fewer and lighting was poor. Miss Marple looked up from the tea she had left to cool in her cup. She saw people stop, turn, search for the scream's source. The second scream was even more anguished than the first. And this time it was accompanied by words, "Help, help, please! Oh God, she is! The screams came from Thomas Ashford, the 18-year-old son of Dr. and Mrs. Ashford. He was a thin, somewhat nervous boy who worked at the local bank. He was running toward the crowd, his arms flailing frantically. "What is happening?" asked Mr. Pemberton, the retired schoolmaster, approaching Thomas. "Has there been an accident?" "It's Eleanor," gasped Thomas, his words tumbling over one another in panic. "Eleanor Fairfax. She is... I think someone has attacked her. There is blood, so much blood." What occurred in the following minutes was a mixture of orderly chaos and genuine horror. Mr. Pemberton, who had served in the war, remained calm enough to telephone the police. several young men from the village ran toward the trees, and Miss Marple, with the assistance of Miss Harrow, rose slowly from her chair, knowing already, without needing to see it, that what they would find was a body. Eleanor Fairfax lay among the dark pines and bare beeches, her beautiful cashmere coat stained with bright red. The wound to her head was terrible, apparently caused by a blunt object. Her body was still warm when Dr. Ashford arrived, confirming that death had been recent, probably within the last 15 or 20 minutes. As local police arrived, filling the festive market with their flashing blue and red lights against the Christmas lights, Miss Marple remained near the tea stall, observing the faces around her. She watched the vicar, who seemed to be praying silently. She watched James Willoughby, the solicitor, whose jaw was clenched tight. She watched Mrs. Pritchard, who had gone so pale she appeared about to faint. But it was the absence that she noticed most of all. David Sutherland had not returned to the market. Neither had Margaret. And in the face of everyone gazing toward where Eleanor lay dead, Miss Marple saw something she recognized. Not merely the shock of murder, but the relief of a buried secret. The relief that it was Eleanor, of all people, who had been eliminated from their lives. "It seems that Christmas has brought something unexpected after all," murmured Miss Marple, as police officers began cordoning off the area with yellow tape, and the Christmas market transformed from a place of joy into a crime scene. By 7 o'clock that evening, St. Mary Mead had become a village divided. The market had been hastily dismantled, vendors ushering away their wares with shaking hands, and the park, which an hour before had been filled with laughter and the scent of cinnamon, was now dominated by police vehicles and the grim purpose of investigation. Inspector Craddock from the county police had arrived. A competent man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who had seen too many crimes and not enough justice. The body of Eleanor Fairfax had been removed, but her absence seemed to linger like a physical presence. The tea stalls had relocated to the village hall, where the community gathered not for festivity, but for the sharing of theories, each more dramatic than the last, each designed to explain away the inexplicable. Miss Marple sat in a corner of the hall, a fresh cup of tea before her, her knitting needles clicking steadily in a rhythm that seemed to soothe rather than agitate. Around her, the village churned with speculation. "It must have been a vagrant," declared Mr. Pemberton, with the certainty of a man who had solved the crime before the body was even cold. "You know these drifters come through in winter, looking for opportunities. A woman alone, managing cash from her stall, it would have been a simple robbery that went wrong." "But Eleanor's handbag was beside her body," pointed out Miss Harrow, always one for facts. "The money inside was untouched. The police said she still had her rings, her watch, hardly the work of a thief." "Then it was someone from outside the village," suggested young Charles Bennet, the solicitor's junior, his eyes bright with the thrill of speculation. "Someone with a grudge. Eleanor wasn't one of us, not really. She only arrived 18 months ago. Who knows what enemies she might have made in London?" Mrs. Catherine Ashford, still pale from her earlier meeting with Eleanor, sat rigidly in a wooden chair. "I think you're all wrong," she said, her voice curiously tight. "I think it was someone who knew her. Someone she threatened in some way. That woman. She had a way of discovering things, private things. Perhaps she discovered something that someone simply couldn't bear to have revealed." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence at this. Several people exchanged glances, and Miss Marple noticed how many of them suddenly became very interested in their tea, or their shoes, or the patterns on the wallpaper. "But who would do such a thing?" asked the vicar, a gentle man called Reverend Hartley, whose faith in human goodness seemed to be undergoing a severe test. "Who among us could be capable of such violence?" "Someone desperate," said James Willoughby, the local solicitor, speaking for the first time since the discovery of the body. His voice was steady, but his fingers drummed against his knee, tap, 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 with a nervous rhythm. Eleanor must have known something about someone, something that mattered enough to kill for. We all know she made her business of knowing secrets. Perhaps she finally knew one that proved too dangerous. "But if that's the case," offered the doctor, Mr. Ashford, "then the killer is surely someone in this village, someone we see every day, someone we might pass in the street without suspicion." This observation seemed to strike a chill through the gathering. The comfortable assumption that the killer was external, unknown, a problem for outsiders to solve, was replaced by the far more disturbing possibility that the murderer sat among them, perhaps in this very room. David Sutherland had not come to the village hall. When someone mentioned this fact, James Willoughby's jaw tightened slightly, and he looked away. Margaret Sutherland had arrived briefly, but left almost immediately, claiming illness, though her expression was less one of illness and more one of profound distress. Miss Marple, watching the reactions to her absence, noted that several people, particularly Charles Bennet and young Thomas Ashford, seemed to relax somewhat when the Sutherlands left. "Where is David?" asked Mr. Pemberton, voicing what several others were thinking. "Surely he would want to hear what the police have to say. He's a respected member of the community." "He's likely at home with his wife," said the vicar defensively. "Margaret appeared quite unwell. One cannot blame him for offering her comfort at such a time." But Miss Marple saw something in the exchange of glances that followed. She saw hesitation, curiosity, and something else. A question unasked but present in the air, like smoke. Had David Sutherland killed Eleanor Fairfax? Had his consultation with her that afternoon been about something so terrible that he had chosen to silence her permanently? The theory gathered strength, whispered from one person to another. David had been seen leaving Eleanor's stall in apparent distress. Margaret had rushed to the market looking distraught. And David was not here to defend himself against the accusations, spoken and unspoken, that began to circulate through the village hall like a contagion. "But why would he?" asked the schoolmistress, Miss Patterson, a sensible woman with little patience for unfounded gossip. "What possible motive could David Sutherland have?" "Eleanor knew something about him," suggested Mrs. Pritchard, her eyes bright with the pleasure of having information to share. "Something he couldn't bear to have known. I always thought there was something odd about him. The way he came to the village so suddenly, with no real history, no previous position that could be verified without extensive inquiry." This was not true, Miss Marple knew. David Sutherland had come with excellent references from his previous school. But she said nothing, merely continued her knitting, listening to the theories proliferate like weeds in an untended garden. What fascinated Miss Marple most, however, was what was not being said. No one mentioned that James Willoughby had also visited Eleanor's stall that afternoon. No one speculated about what the solicitor might have needed to discuss with her. And no one seemed to wonder what Mrs. Ashford's reddened eyes might signify. That Eleanor had known something about Catherine Ashford that had caused genuine distress. By 9 o'clock, when Inspector Craddock called everyone to order to take initial statements, a consensus had begun to form in the village collective mind. David Sutherland was the most likely suspect. He was the one with the most obvious distress following his encounter with Eleanor. He was the one who had not appeared at the village hall to defend himself. He was, in the language of amateur detectives everywhere, the one with something to hide. The inspector, however, seemed less certain. Miss Marple observed him as he conducted his interviews, noting how his questions probed deeper than the obvious. When he spoke with David Sutherland, who arrived at the hall at 10 o'clock, looking as though he had been through an ordeal, his manner was formal but not accusatory. When he interviewed Eleanor's few friends and acquaintances, he asked not only about her death, but about her life, her business, her relationships in the village. "Did Miss Fairfax have any enemies?" he asked young Thomas Ashford. "Not enemies exactly," stammered Thomas, "but I think people were afraid of her. Not of her doing anything violent, but of what she knew. She had a way of understanding things about people. Things they preferred to keep private." "Did she ever mention any threats? Anyone who had expressed anger toward her?" "No, Inspector. But that was the peculiar thing. She didn't seem concerned about anything. She was always calm, always smiling, even when she must have known that some of her knowledge could cause real harm to people in the village." As the interviews continued, a pattern began to emerge that Miss Marple perceived, but which seemed to escape the notice of the inspector, at least judging by the direction his questions took. Eleanor Fairfax had been much more than a harmless provider of life consultations. She had been a repository of secrets, yes, but more than that. She had been using those secrets carefully and deliberately to exert influence over people in the village. Mrs. Ashford's reddened eyes, Miss Marple surmised, likely related to Eleanor's knowledge of some indiscretion in her marriage. James Willoughby's tense demeanour might relate to something Eleanor knew about his law practice, perhaps financial irregularities or personal impropriety. And David Sutherland's visible distress could relate to any number of things: his background, his credentials, his past. But the question that occupied Miss Marple's agile mind was not who among these obviously troubled individuals had killed Eleanor Fairfax. The question was far more interesting. What had Eleanor known about each of them? And was her knowledge of their secrets the true motive for her death, or merely a convenient cover for someone else's crime entirely? As midnight approached and the inspector finally released the villagers to their homes, Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair, gathering her knitting into her bag with careful, practiced movements. She had lived long enough to know that the obvious suspect is rarely the guilty party. And she had observed enough of human nature to understand that when a woman like Eleanor Fairfax, a woman who dealt in secrets and influence, met a violent end, the explanation was usually far more complex than simple motive and opportunity. "Good night, Miss Marple," said the vicar as she prepared to leave. "What a terrible business this is. I do hope the inspector finds the real killer soon. The thought that someone in our community could commit such an act." "Oh, I expect he will find the killer," said Miss Marple gently. "The question is whether he will understand the true reason for the killing. Human behavior, Reverend Hartley, is rarely as straightforward as it appears. Just like Mrs. Hudson's rose garden, there are always layers beneath the surface, each one hiding something unexpected." The vicar looked puzzled by this comparison, but Miss Marple simply patted his arm kindly and made her way out into the cold December night, where the Christmas lights of St. Mary Mead still twinkled despite the darkness that had so recently descended upon them. The morning after Eleanor's death dawned grey and cold, with the threat of snow hanging heavy in the air. Inspector Craddock had set up a temporary office in the village hall, and by 8 o'clock he had begun his systematic examination of the crime scene and his more formal interviews with the people Eleanor had known and encountered. What emerged, piece by piece, was a portrait of a woman who had been far more complex than the village's surface understanding suggested. Eleanor Fairfax's cottage, searched under warrant early that morning, revealed a series of carefully maintained files containing notes on virtually every person of significance in St. Mary Mead. The files contained dates, observations, and snippets of information, some seeming innocuous, others deeply damaging. The inspector's expression when he discovered these files was one of grim understanding. Whatever Eleanor Fairfax had been doing in her consultations, it was not simply providing advice. She had been conducting a systematic investigation of her neighbours, documenting their secrets, their vulnerabilities, their fears. "It's blackmail, isn't it?" said the constable who had discovered the files. His youthful face flushed with the realization. She was blackmailing people. "Perhaps," replied Inspector Craddock carefully. "Or perhaps she was simply collecting information. The question is whether she was using it, and if so, to what end?" Miss Marple, who had been summoned to provide a statement, as she had been present at the market and had observed many of the relevant individuals, used her interview with the inspector to gather information rather than simply provide it. She learned that Eleanor's bank records showed regular deposits of modest sums from a variety of sources. She learned that Eleanor's previous addresses in London included a street known for its investment and financial advisory services. And she learned, most intriguingly, that Eleanor's full name was Eleanor Fairfax Whitmore, and she had once been involved in a company that provided what the records delicately referred to as research and consultation services. "It seems Miss Fairfax was something of a professional," Miss Marple observed mildly to the inspector, who had become comfortable enough with her to speak relatively openly. "A professional what, Miss Marple? That is the question that troubles me. Professional consultant? Professional blackmailer? Professional what, exactly?" "I suspect," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that Miss Fairfax was a professional in the gathering and application of intelligence. Whether that intelligence was gathered ethically or not is perhaps a secondary question. The more pressing question is, who in this village felt threatened enough by her to commit murder?" The inspector leaned back in his chair, studying the elderly woman before him. "You've been remarkably analytical, Miss Marple. Most people in the village simply offer their shock and speculation. You offer observations." "I have lived a very long time, Inspector, and I have learned that human nature is remarkably consistent. We see patterns in our village that might as easily be patterns in London or anywhere else. The person who killed Eleanor Fairfax did not do so impulsively. They did so because they believed that their secret, or someone's secret that they cared about, was about to be exposed or used against them. This suggests premeditation, planning, a desperation that had reached a critical point. You think the killer knew Eleanor planned to use their secret against them?" "I think," said Miss Marple carefully, "that the killer believed Eleanor planned to do so. Whether she actually intended to is another matter entirely." Over the next 2 days, as Christmas approached with an increasingly macabre irony, the investigation deepened. The inspector discovered that Eleanor had been involved in what might generously be called a scheme to provide advance information to certain business people in London, information about the personal vulnerabilities of their competitors and associates. She had been, in essence, a professional gatherer of compromising information, and she had built a significant income from her work before retiring to St. Mary Mead. But why retire to a small English village? This was the question that continued to plague the investigation. Eleanor was financially secure, had no family in the area, and had constructed an entirely new identity as a harmless purveyor of Christmas wishes and life advice. Unless, as the inspector began to suspect, her retirement was not truly retirement at all, but relocation to a place where she could continue her work with less scrutiny and more opportunity. The small village of St. Mary Mead, with its population of notable people, a solicitor, a doctor, a schoolmaster, a vicar, various landowners and business proprietors, would have been perfect for Eleanor's purposes. And her consultations were the ideal cover for gathering information that might later be used or sold to interested parties. "But to whom?" asked the constable, struggling with the logistics of the scheme. "Who would pay for information about people in a small village? Perhaps people who had dealings with inhabitants of a small village," suggested Miss Marple, whom the inspector had called in to discuss the implications of what they had discovered. "Perhaps competitors in business, or spouses considering divorce, or individuals with professional interests in the secrets of others." It was this conversation that led the inspector to begin examining the financial records more carefully. What he discovered was that Eleanor had indeed been making regular payments to someone in London, payments that suggested ongoing work, ongoing provision of information. Eleanor had not simply retired to St. Mary Mead. She had opened a new office, a new operational centre, in what appeared to be an ideal location for expanding her already lucrative business. "So she was still blackmailing people," said the inspector grimly, "or rather, gathering information for others who would blackmail them." "Not necessarily," said Miss Marple, "or perhaps that is unfair to the truth. There are many ways to use information, Inspector. Some malevolent, some merely self-protective, some born of simple human curiosity. The question remains, which inhabitants of St. Mary Mead did Eleanor's activities threaten enough to provoke murder? The obvious suspects remained David Sutherland and, to a lesser extent, James Willoughby. But as the inspector's investigation deepened, other names began to surface. Thomas Ashford, the young man who had discovered Eleanor's body, had visited her stall on multiple occasions. Young Charles Bennet had been seen speaking with Eleanor just days before the murder. Even the vicar, Reverend Hartley, admitted to having had a consultation with Eleanor, though he insisted it had been about nothing more than his spiritual concerns. But it was David Sutherland who remained at the centre of the investigation. The inspector's questions became increasingly pointed, his suspicion increasingly evident. What exactly had Eleanor told him during their consultation? Why had his wife rushed to remove him from the market immediately afterward? Why had he not returned to the market scene after being told of the murder? And most damningly, where exactly had he been between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock on the afternoon of December 21st? David's answer was that he had been at home, preparing Christmas preparations with his wife. Margaret confirmed this, but her confirmation seemed forced, and the inspector was not satisfied. "He's going to arrest him," said Miss Harrow to Miss Marple on the morning of December 23rd, as the inspector made yet another visit to the village to conduct further interviews. "Everyone says so. David Sutherland is going to be arrested for Eleanor's murder." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, watching the inspector's car pull up in front of the police station that had been hastily established in the village. Or perhaps the inspector is being more careful than we give him credit for. It is not wise to arrest the obvious suspect when there are still questions unanswered. "What questions?" asked Miss Harrow. "It seems perfectly clear to me." "Then you're not observing carefully enough," said Miss Marple gently. "Tell me, Miss Harrow, why did the inspector spend so much time yesterday examining Eleanor's financial records? What could David Sutherland's income have to do with Eleanor's death? And why did he ask so many questions about James Willoughby's law practice? Surely if David Sutherland is the killer, these matters are irrelevant." Miss Harrow looked confused, as most people did when confronted with Miss Marple's method of reasoning. But Miss Marple continued to observe, continued to listen, continued to perceive the patterns that others overlooked. And in those patterns, she began to see something that even the inspector had not yet fully grasped. That the murder of Eleanor Fairfax, far from being a simple crime of passion or protection, was far more deliberately planned and far more deliberately executed than anyone yet realized. On the afternoon of December 23rd, with Christmas just 2 days away, Inspector Craddock took a decision that would prove either brilliant or catastrophic. He arrested David Sutherland on suspicion of murder. The arrest was conducted quietly and with professional courtesy, but it sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead that were felt as powerfully as if a bomb had exploded in the village square. The schoolmaster, respected, well-liked, seemingly devoted to his wife and his profession, was led away in a police car, and within hours the village consensus had crystallized. The killer had been caught, justice would be served, and Christmas could proceed with a sense of closure and relief. But Miss Marple, sitting in her comfortable chair by the window of her cottage on December 23rd afternoon, was troubled in a way that transcended simple doubt. The evidence against David seemed, on its face, substantial. He had been seen leaving Eleanor's stall in obvious distress. His wife had rushed to remove him from the market immediately after his consultation with Eleanor. He had given a somewhat vague account of his whereabouts at the time of the murder, claiming to have been at home, preparing Christmas decorations, though his wife's corroboration seemed reluctant rather than reassuring. And when the inspector had interviewed him further, asking specifically what Eleanor had revealed to him during their consultation, David had refused to answer, claiming the consultation was a private matter between himself and Eleanor. If he has nothing to hide, the inspector had reasoned, why not simply explain what Eleanor told him? The explanation would either eliminate him as a suspect or confirm him as one. It was this logic that had apparently led the inspector to conclude that David's refusal to speak indicated guilt. But Miss Marple, having lived through many years of observation of human nature, understood that refusal to speak could indicate many things. Shame, fear, the desire to protect someone else, the wish to preserve privacy, or even simple stubborn pride. She had, of course, attended the arrest, not in the sense of being present at the moment it occurred, but in the sense that she had learned of it immediately, and had formed her own conclusions about its implications. Margaret Sutherland had been with her husband when the police arrived. Miss Marple, visiting the cottage on the pretext of delivering some Christmas biscuits she had baked, had witnessed the moment David was taken away. What struck her most forcefully was not David's expression, which was one of grim resignation, but Margaret's. Margaret's face had shown relief, unmistakable and profound. As David was led toward the police car, Margaret had reached out and gripped his arm, and in that grip was not the gesture of a devoted wife standing by her husband in his darkest hour, but something far more complex. It was the grip of someone who had been released from an intolerable burden. This observation stayed with Miss Marple as the afternoon progressed. She sat with her knitting, clicking the needles in their familiar rhythm, and allowed her mind to turn over the implications of what she had seen. Margaret's relief at her husband's arrest suggested that David had been a source of significant distress in the household. But was that distress related to Eleanor Fairfax and whatever she had revealed during their consultation, or was it related to something else entirely? At 4 o'clock, as the winter light was already fading from the sky, Miss Marple received a visitor. It was James Willoughby, the local solicitor, who arrived at her door looking troubled, and she noted with interest, somewhat guilty. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I've come because I believe I may have done David Sutherland a grave injustice, and I felt it incumbent upon me to seek your advice." Miss Marple invited him in, prepared tea, and settled into her chair to listen. It was James's habit, she had observed over the years, to unburden himself of information when he believed himself complicit in some wrongdoing. He was not a bad man, merely a weak one, and weakness in men often expressed itself as confession when the burden became too heavy. "You see," James began, his fingers twisting nervously in his lap, "David came to me 2 weeks ago, seeking legal advice regarding a rather delicate matter. I cannot, of course, reveal the specifics of our conversation due to solicitor-client privilege. But I can tell you that Eleanor Fairfax was involved in the matter, and she had discovered certain information that David was deeply concerned about." "Information regarding David?" asked Miss Marple carefully. "Information regarding David, and regarding someone else in the village," James said, choosing his words with care. Eleanor had discovered something that could have had severe consequences for both parties involved. David was attempting to determine what legal recourse he might have to prevent Eleanor from using this information against him. "And did you advise him?" "I advised him," said James slowly, "that his options were limited. Eleanor's knowledge, while potentially damaging, was not in itself illegal. He could not simply prevent her from speaking about it. His best course, I suggested, was to come to some sort of arrangement with her. A financial arrangement, if necessary." "Which would have been blackmail," observed Miss Marple mildly. "A harsh word," said James uncomfortably. "But yes, essentially. David could have paid Eleanor to keep silent, or at least to limit the scope of her revelations." "And did David indicate that he would do this?" "That is the matter that troubles me," said James. "When I suggested this course of action, David seemed to withdraw into himself. He said something like, 'I would rather die than pay money to that woman.' And then he left my office in a state of considerable agitation. I did not see him again until after Eleanor's death." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "Mr. Willoughby, your conscience is troubling you because you believe that by refusing your advice, David was driven to murder. You believe that if you had been more persuasive, or if David had been more willing to consider your suggestion, Eleanor would still be alive?" "That is exactly what troubles me," James admitted. "I feel, in some obscure way, complicit in her death." "But surely," Miss Marple continued thoughtfully, "you do not actually believe that David Sutherland murdered Eleanor Fairfax simply because he was too proud to pay her for her silence?" "The police seem to think so," said James, "and when you consider the evidence, his distress, his presence in the village at the time of the murder, his clear motive, it does seem rather damning." Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to the window. Looking out at the darkening village, "Mr. Willoughby, I have a question for you, and I would appreciate a truthful answer. When Eleanor consulted you, for I assume she also gave you one of her consultations, what information did she reveal to you about yourself?" There was a long silence. Finally, James spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "She revealed that I have been embezzling from my clients' trust accounts, small amounts over several years. I have been covering it with money from my own accounts, intending to repay it. But Eleanor knew. She had somehow discovered it." "And did you pay her to keep quiet?" "I did," admitted James, £50 a month, a small amount but significant to me nonetheless." "And you gave her this money under the assumption that she would keep your secret?" "Yes, though I confess I had doubts. Eleanor was not the sort of woman one could trust, despite her assurances." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working through the implications of this revelation. "Then Eleanor was not simply gathering secrets, Mr. Willoughby. She was actively blackmailing people in this village, and the amounts were carefully calibrated to be sustainable over time. Not so large as to provoke rebellion or desperation, but sufficient to create an ongoing relationship of financial dependence." "It was a brilliant scheme," said James bitterly. "She had many victims. I discovered as much when the police were searching her cottage. The financial records revealed regular payments from at least 5 different people in the village, each of whom had secrets that Eleanor was exploiting." "And yet," said Miss Marple, returning to her chair, "these 5 people were not all equally inclined toward murder, I would imagine. Surely some of them would have been content to continue their payments indefinitely rather than risk the consequences of killing Eleanor." "One would think so," agreed James. "But I confess I am troubled by the question of David. Of all Eleanor's victims, he was the one most visibly distraught. The secret she held over him. It was not merely a matter of personal shame or financial impropriety. It was something that could have destroyed his life entirely." "And what was that secret?" asked Miss Marple, though she suspected she already knew the answer. James hesitated, clearly torn between his solicitor's oath of confidentiality and his desire to clear his conscience. "I cannot tell you precisely," he finally said, "but I can tell you that it involved someone David cares about deeply. Eleanor had discovered that David had falsified documents several years ago, before he came to St. Mary Mead. He had done so in order to protect someone, and Eleanor had threatened to expose this falsification to the authorities, which would have resulted not only in David's arrest and imprisonment, but in serious consequences for the person he had been protecting as well." Miss Marple absorbed this information, turning it over in her mind like a jeweller examining a stone for hidden flaws. "A man might be driven to desperate measures," she said slowly, "if faced with the choice of allowing someone he loves to suffer as a consequence of his actions, or acting to prevent that suffering by any means necessary." "Exactly," said James. "And that is why I believe the police are right to suspect David. He had both motive and opportunity, and he has refused to explain what Eleanor told him during their consultation, which suggests he has something to hide." "Or," said Miss Marple quietly, "it suggests that he is protecting someone else, even at the cost of his own liberty. The question is whether that protection extends to committing murder." James left shortly after this, and Miss Marple sat alone with her thoughts as the darkness settled completely over the village. Outside her window, the Christmas lights that had been strung up before Eleanor's death seemed to mock the gravity of the situation. 2 days until Christmas, and a man had been arrested for a crime he may or may not have committed. The village wanted closure, wanted to believe that their schoolmaster their trusted educator of children, had been the villain all along. It was far easier to believe in a monster than to contemplate that the real darkness might lie elsewhere, in hearts less obviously troubled than David Sutherland's. By 9 o'clock that evening, Miss Marple had made a decision. She would visit David Sutherland in the police cells and speak with him directly. She would observe his face, his manner, his response to her questions. And from that observation, she would attempt to determine what the truth might actually be. The police, she knew, would not prevent her. They had learned long ago that Miss Marple's observations were often valuable, and Inspector Craddock had developed a respect for her methods that transcended the usual protocols of investigation. If she wished to speak with the accused, they would likely permit it. But first, she had one other question that needed answering, one other theory that needed testing. And for that, she would need to do something quite unusual. She would need to initiate a conversation with Margaret Sutherland and observe, with all the careful attention at her disposal, whether the wife was telling the truth about her husband's innocence. The next morning, December 24th, Christmas Eve, dawned with a thin covering of snow that gave the village an even more fairy tale quality than the market decorations had. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and prepared herself for the day with careful attention to detail. She wore her best dark coat, the one with the pearl buttons, and she arranged her hair with particular care. If she was to speak with Margaret Sutherland, she wished to present an appearance of respectability and purpose, not the doddering elderly woman that so many in the village took her to be. She found Margaret at her home, preparing Christmas decorations with an energy that seemed almost frantic. When Margaret saw Miss Marple at her door, her first reaction was one of caution, followed quickly by what appeared to be genuine relief. This reaction told Miss Marple a great deal. "Oh, Miss Marple," Margaret said, ushering her inside with visible anxiety. "I'm so glad you've come. Everyone has been avoiding me since David's arrest. They look at me as though I'm somehow complicit, as though I should have known, should have prevented this." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple mildly, "I have come because I believe you may be the only person in this village who truly understands what your husband has been going through. And I suspect you know more about his reasons for remaining silent than you have told the police." Margaret's face paled, and she gestured for Miss Marple to sit. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice was unconvincing. "Let me be frank, Mrs. Sutherland," said Miss Marple, settling herself into a chair with the deliberate slowness of extreme age. "I have observed you closely since Eleanor's death, as I observe all things closely. I have noticed that despite your husband's arrest, despite the serious accusations against him, you do not appear to be afraid. Rather, you appear to be relieved, as though a burden has been lifted from you. Is that accurate?" Margaret sank into a chair opposite Miss Marple, her face crumpling slightly. "It's not what you think," she said. I would never have wanted Eleanor dead. But yes, since David's arrest, I have felt a sense of relief. Because as long as David was free, as long as he was walking around this village, I was living in constant terror that Eleanor's secret would be revealed. And now that he's been arrested, now that everyone believes he killed her, the secret is safe. That's what the relief is. It's the relief of knowing that I will never have to face what I was so frightened of." "And what secret is that?" asked Miss Marple. "The one that Eleanor had discovered." Margaret looked at her for a long moment, and Miss Marple saw the struggle in her face, the desire to unburden herself warring with the need to protect her husband. Finally, Margaret spoke. 7 years ago, she said slowly, I had a relationship with another man. Not a full relationship, I was unfaithful to David, but only emotionally, not physically. It was a mistake. It lasted only a few weeks, and I ended it when I realized how much I was hurting David. David never knew about it, or at least I didn't think he knew. I thought it was a secret that would die with me. But Eleanor knew, said Miss Marple gently. Eleanor knew everything, said Margaret bitterly. She knew about the man. She knew his name. She knew where I had met him. She knew the dates. And when she came to David with her knowledge, she told him that she would reveal everything to me, to my family, to the parish priest, unless he paid her to keep silent. But the true threat wasn't really about revealing my infidelity. It was about something deeper. Which was? Prompted Miss Marple. Margaret took a breath, as though preparing herself to say something that had been bottled up for a very long time. The man I was involved with was Robert Ashford, Dr. Ashford's younger brother, the brother nobody in the village knows about because Robert disappeared 7 years ago. He left the village suddenly, and officially the reason was that he had found work elsewhere. But the truth is, David told him to leave. David knew about Robert and me. I don't know how he found out, but he did. And David asked Robert to leave the village and never contact me again. Robert agreed, but only on condition that I would be allowed to divorce David if I wished and follow him. But you chose to stay with David, said Miss Marple, understanding the situation more clearly now. I chose to stay, said Margaret, tears now running down her face, because despite my foolishness, despite my infidelity, I loved my husband, and Robert was a decent man. He understood that I had made my choice. So he left, and David and I rebuilt our marriage. We have been happy, Miss Marple, genuinely happy. And then Eleanor discovered this secret, and she began to threaten to reveal it, not just to me, but to Robert's family, to the village. She said that Robert would be shamed, that the Ashford family's reputation would be damaged, that David had no right to have forced Robert to leave the village. And so David's distress, said Miss Marple thoughtfully, was not fear of his own exposure, but fear of the pain that would be caused to Robert and his family if Eleanor revealed what had happened. Yes, said Margaret, Eleanor's real weapon was not my infidelity, which 7 years on has little power to harm anyone. Her real weapon was the implication that David had acted wrongly in forcing Robert to leave, and the threat that she would manipulate the situation to cause Robert pain and confusion. Miss Marple was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. And David chose to remain silent about this rather than explain it to the police. David has always been a man of his word, said Margaret. He promised Robert 7 years ago that he would keep this secret. David would not break that promise, even to save himself from a murder charge. He would rather go to prison than betray Robert's trust. And yet, said Miss Marple, your relief at David's arrest suggests that you were relieved to have the secret protected, regardless of the cost to David. That is a complicated matter, Mrs. Sutherland. Margaret's face flushed with shame. Yes, I am ashamed to admit it, but the truth is, I was terrified. And when David was arrested, I realized that the secret would be buried with him, that Helena's death meant David would never have to use his knowledge of Robert to pay her blackmail, and David's arrest meant he would never reveal the truth about Robert to defend himself. The secret is safe, but at such a cost. The question that concerns me most, said Miss Marple, rising slowly from her chair, is whether David killed Eleanor Fairfax. and I suspect, Mrs. Sutherland, that you know the answer to that question. Did you kill Eleanor? Is that why you are relieved at David's arrest?" Margaret's face went white. "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "No, I did not kill her, but I was terrified she would destroy us all. And when David left the house that afternoon, when he came home so distressed from his consultation with Eleanor, I knew that we were running out of time. I knew something would have to give." "Where did David go when he left the house that afternoon?" asked Miss Marple sharply. "I don't know," said Margaret. "He said he needed to walk, needed to think. He was gone for nearly 2 hours. When he came back, he was still distressed, but somehow resigned, as though he had made a decision." "And what decision might that have been?" asked Miss Marple, though she was beginning to form her own theories about the answer. "I think," said Margaret slowly, "that David decided to kill Eleanor. I think he walked for those 2 hours and decided that the only way to protect Robert, to protect me, to protect our marriage, was to eliminate the threat that Eleanor represented." "But the police have not been able to prove that David killed Eleanor," said Miss Marple. "They have circumstantial evidence, yes, but no concrete proof. If David had actually killed her, would the evidence not be more definitive?" "Unless," said Margaret, her eyes widening with a new thought, "unless someone else killed her at exactly the same time that David was walking around the village planning how to murder her. Unless, by the most incredible coincidence, another person decided independently that Eleanor needed to be eliminated." Miss Marple left Margaret's house shortly after this, her mind churning with new possibilities. Margaret's revelation about Robert Ashford and the secret David had kept for 7 years provided a motive for David's distress and his silence. But it did not necessarily prove that David was Eleanor's killer. And there was something else, something that had been nagging at Miss Marple's attention since she had first observed the crime scene, that she had not yet fully processed. It was the question of the weapon. Eleanor had been killed with what appeared to be a heavy object, possibly a candlestick, possibly a paperweight, something blunt and probably ornamental. The murder weapon had never been found. The police had searched the area around the murder site extensively, but the weapon had simply vanished, which meant either that the killer had carried it away with them, or that it was something that had been disposed of elsewhere. Miss Marple made her way to the police station, where Inspector Craddock received her with the courtesy he reserved for people whose observations he valued. She asked to see the list of items found in Eleanor's stall and in the immediate vicinity of the murder site. What she was searching for was a description of any decorative objects that might have been used as a weapon, and the answer came quickly. Among the items in Eleanor's stall had been a number of Christmas decorations offered for sale, including several heavy glass Christmas balls, and, most intriguingly, a set of decorative brass candlesticks that Eleanor had purchased at an antique fair in the neighboring town 3 weeks earlier. These candlesticks had been displayed in Eleanor's stall, but when the police had catalogued the items after her death, the candlesticks had been missing. "One of the candlesticks," said the inspector, showing Miss Marple the list, "appears to have been used as the murder weapon. We found traces of blood and hair on the other candlestick, which was discovered near the murder site. But the candlestick that was actually used to strike the fatal blow has never been recovered." "Which suggests," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that the murderer took the weapon with them when they fled. That would require forethought and planning. It would suggest that the murder was premeditated rather than a crime of passion." "Which supports the theory that David Sutherland is guilty," said the inspector. "He would have had time to dispose of the candlestick somewhere between the time of the murder and his arrest." But Miss Marple's mind was working on a different problem entirely, because what she had observed in all her years of careful attention to human behaviour was that the most carefully planned crimes were often the ones that contained the smallest errors. And she suspected that somewhere in the details of Eleanor's death there was a small error that would reveal the true killer. Not the obvious suspect, not the man the village wanted to believe was guilty, but the person who had actually committed the act. That evening, as Christmas Eve settled over St. Mary Mead with snow and darkness, Miss Marple sat in her cottage and allowed her mind to review everything she had observed. The pattern was there, she knew it. The subtle clue that no one else had noticed. The small error that had escaped everyone's attention. And slowly, piece by piece, the pattern began to clarify. By midnight, as the church bells rang out for Christmas morning, Miss Marple believed she had understood the truth. It was a truth that surprised her, that contradicted the obvious suspects, that revealed layers of deception and complexity far beyond what the simple theory of David Sutherland's guilt could encompass. And she knew, with the absolute certainty that came from a lifetime of observation, that the truth was going to be far more complicated, far more tragic and far more human than anyone in St. Mary Mead yet suspected. Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with the snow of the previous evening having given the village a picture postcard appearance that seemed almost cruel, in its contrast with the darkness that had descended upon the community. The church was full for the Christmas service, though attendance had a quality of obligation rather than celebration. People sat with their families, sang the familiar carols, and tried to pretend that one of their own was not sitting in a police cell, accused of murder. Miss Marple attended the service as she always did, occupying her usual pew near the window. She observed the faces around her as carefully as she observed the vicar's words, noting reactions, interpreting silences, reading the subtext beneath the surface civility. What she was looking for was confirmation of her theory, and she found it in several revealing moments. When the vicar spoke of forgiveness and redemption, she watched James Willoughby's face tighten, saw him grip his prayer book with white knuckles. When a hymn about concealment and revelation was sung, she observed the flush that rose in Thomas Ashford's cheeks. And when the blessing was given, she noted with particular interest the way that Mrs. Catherine Ashford's hands trembled as she pressed them together in prayer. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the cold morning, Miss Marple made her way deliberately toward James Willoughby. She caught him before he could escape into the crowd. "Mr. Willoughby," she said, her voice carrying just enough authority to make him stop and turn to face her. "I wonder if we might have a private conversation, perhaps in the vicarage study." James's face went pale. "I'm not sure I know what you mean, Miss Marple." "I think you do," she replied gently but firmly. "I think you know exactly what I mean. And I suspect you've been keeping secrets of a rather significant nature. Secrets that relate to Eleanor Fairfax's murder." They retired to the vicarage study, where Reverend Hartley left them alone with a tactful discretion. Once the door was closed, James sank into a chair as though his legs could no longer support his weight. "What do you want?" he asked wearily. "I've already told the police what I know. I have no more to say." "On the contrary," said Miss Marple, settling herself into the chair opposite him. I believe you have a great deal more to say. You see, Mr. Willoughby, I have been observing the people of this village for a very long time, and I have noticed that people who are carrying heavy burdens often reveal themselves through small gestures, careful word choices, and moments of unguarded emotion. And I observed something about you on the morning after Eleanor's death that has been troubling me ever since. What did you observe? Asked James, though he did not seem to truly want to know the answer. I observed, said Miss Marple, that when the inspector was questioning you about Eleanor's consultation with you, you volunteered information that you were not asked for. You mentioned that you had considered paying Eleanor to keep your financial improprieties secret. But the inspector did not ask you how much you had paid her. He did not ask you when the payments had begun. He did not ask you whether you had ever considered stopping them. Yet you offered all of this information as though you had prepared it beforehand, as though you had rehearsed the narrative you would present. I was simply being forthcoming, said James defensively. You were, agreed Miss Marple, but only about matters that were relatively unimportant. You carefully avoided discussing anything that might lead the investigation in a direction you did not wish it to go. And I suspect that direction has to do with Eleanor's actual power over you, and the true nature of the scheme in which you were entangled. James was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was defeated. You're right, he said. Eleanor wasn't simply blackmailing me over my financial irregularities. That was part of it, yes, but it wasn't the main thing. The main thing was much worse. Tell me, said Miss Marple simply. Before I came to St. Mary Mead, said James slowly, I had a different life. I was married to a woman named Elizabeth. We had a son together, Timothy. Elizabeth was a difficult woman, unstable, prone to violence, particularly toward Timothy. I tried to protect him, but the courts would not listen to my concerns. They gave Elizabeth primary custody. When Timothy was 7 years old, Elizabeth drowned him in the bath during one of her rages. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but her eyes seemed to grow older, if that were possible. After Timothy's death, I left London. I changed my identity, obtained new credentials, and came to St. Mary Mead to start over. I became James Willoughby, a competent country solicitor. I have lived a good life here, a decent life. I have helped people. I have paid back the money I embezzled, slowly but surely. I have tried to be someone better than I was in London. And Eleanor discovered this, said Miss Marple. She discovered your real identity and the tragic circumstances of your past. More than that, said James bitterly. Eleanor discovered that Timothy was not actually dead, that Elizabeth had lied about his death to punish me for trying to take him from her, that Timothy is now 14 years old, living with his mother, believing that I am dead, and being raised by a woman who is still, as far as I can determine, dangerous and unstable. The weight of this revelation hung in the air between them. And Eleanor threatened to reveal this to you? Asked Miss Marple. She threatened to tell you that your son was alive? Worse, said James. Eleanor threatened to contact Timothy's mother, to contact Timothy, to reveal everything. She said that Timothy had a right to know his father, and that she would ensure he learned the truth. But I knew better. I knew that if Elizabeth learned that I had located her and Timothy, she would move, disappear again, and I would lose them forever. And if Timothy was told the truth without preparation, without legal safeguards, he would likely be drawn into Elizabeth's orbit and damaged by it, as I had been. So Eleanor was holding you hostage, said Miss Marple, not with the threat of revelation, but with the threat of action. She was threatening to actively involve herself in your family situation in ways that could have catastrophic consequences." "Yes," said James, "and I paid her. I paid her more than I have ever paid anyone in my life. I paid her the money that I had been slowly repaying to the clients I had embezzled. I paid her money that I could barely afford. And still, it was not enough. Still, she demanded more. Still, she threatened to contact Timothy's mother. And then Eleanor was killed," said Miss Marple. "And then Eleanor was killed," James repeated, as though the words meant nothing to him. "Did you kill her?" asked Miss Marple, her voice gentle but direct. "No," said James, and something in his tone made Miss Marple believe him. "No, I did not kill her. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. But I did not. I could not take the risk, because if something happened to Eleanor before she had told me that she would stop threatening me, I would have destroyed whatever fragile balance existed between safety and catastrophe." "Then who did kill her?" asked Miss Marple. "I don't know," said James, "but I know that whoever it was, they did it for reasons that had nothing to do with James Willoughby's secrets. They did it for their own reasons, reasons that involve someone else entirely." Miss Marple left the vicarage study thoughtfully. James Willoughby, whatever his sins, was not Eleanor's killer. This she knew with the certainty that came from years of reading human behavior. But his revelation had opened a new avenue of investigation, one that led away from David Sutherland and toward a more complex and darker truth. Over the next 2 days, as the village celebrated Christmas with an undertone of anxiety and dread, Miss Marple conducted a series of careful conversations. She spoke with Thomas Ashford and discovered that Eleanor had learned about his secret, that he had forged bank records on behalf of a customer, covering up significant financial fraud. She had been threatening to report him to the authorities unless he paid her an amount that would have bankrupted him. She spoke with Mrs. Pritchard and learned that Eleanor had discovered that her daughter, living in London, had been arrested for drug trafficking. Eleanor had threatened to reveal this to the village, destroying the woman's reputation and her daughter's prospects for rehabilitation. She spoke with young Charles Bennet and discovered that Eleanor had learned he was the biological son of a man he had been raised to believe was unrelated to his family, a man who was now a senior judge. Eleanor was threatening to use this information to damage the judge's reputation and advance her own financial interests. Each conversation revealed a new layer of Eleanor's influence, a new depth to her power over the village. Eleanor Fairfax had not come to St. Mary Mead simply to retire. She had come to prey on the guilt, shame, and secrets of a small community, extracting payment for silence and threatening revelation at the slightest sign of resistance. But what struck Miss Marple most forcefully was not the complexity of Eleanor's schemes, but a simple fact that she had observed and that no one else seemed to have noticed. Eleanor's stall had been decorated with a display of Christmas gifts, wrapped in elegant paper and ribbons. These gifts were for sale, but they were also for show. And among these gifts, in the days before Eleanor's death, Miss Marple had observed one particular present, a small, elegantly wrapped box that had seemed to hold particular significance. On the morning of December 27th, having received permission from the police, Miss Marple visited Eleanor's cottage once more. The cottage had been searched, but not everything had been removed. Photographs remained on the mantelpiece, books remained on the shelves, and in Eleanor's sitting room, on a small table beside her writing desk, Miss Marple found what she was looking for. It was a diary, leather-bound and elegantly written. The entries were sparse but detailed, each one a record of consultation, each one naming names and noting secrets. And in the final entry, dated December 21st, the day of Eleanor's death, was a single sentence that explained everything. Have arranged meeting with TA in the evening. Must be careful. Information regarding MA is sensitive. Final payment demanded. No more negotiation after this. TA Thomas Ashford, M.A. Margaret Ashford, or Margaret Ashford before her marriage, Margaret Ashford as a girl. Miss Marple's mind worked through the possibilities, turning them over, examining them from every angle. And then it struck her. A connection she had somehow overlooked. A pattern in the observations she had made that suddenly resolved into clarity. Margaret Ashford, Margaret Sutherland, Thomas Ashford. They were siblings. And if Thomas Ashford had come to Eleanor on December 21st, if Eleanor had told him something about his sister Margaret, something that went beyond David's affair with Robert, something from their shared family history, then Thomas would have had a motive. A young man, protective of his sister, learning some new secret from Eleanor. Something that had been hidden for years, something that Margaret herself may not even have known. Miss Marple returned to the police station and asked to see the full investigation file. The inspector, trusting her judgment by now, granted her access. And in that file, she found what she suspected she would find: Thomas Ashford's account of his movements on December 21st. Thomas had claimed that he had been working at the bank until 4 o'clock, then had gone directly home. His parents had confirmed that he was home by 5 o'clock. But Miss Marple, with her knowledge of the village's geography, knew that it took at most 15 minutes to walk from the bank to home. The bank closed at 3:30 on Saturdays. Thomas had claimed to have stayed late to finish year-end reconciliation. That gave him time, more than enough time. And if Eleanor had threatened Thomas with something regarding Margaret, something terrible enough to make him do what the police had not yet determined he had done, then his silence would make sense. A young man would protect his sister, just as David had protected Robert. A young man might commit murder to prevent his sister's suffering, just as the police had suspected David of doing. But Thomas Ashford was 18 years old, working at the bank, living with his parents. He was not the obvious suspect. He was not the person on whom suspicion had fallen. And because of that, the investigation had focused on David Sutherland and missed the truth entirely. On December 28th, 1 week after Eleanor's death, Miss Marple asked to speak with Thomas Ashford privately. She arranged to meet him at her cottage, under the pretext of needing assistance with a small household task. When Thomas arrived, she observed him carefully. He was thin, nervous, and his eyes had the quality of someone who had not slept properly in days. He was also, she noted with the clarity of observation, carrying a weight of guilt that was nearly overwhelming. "Mr. Ashford," she began without preamble, once they were seated, "I have been conducting my own investigation into the death of Eleanor Fairfax, and I have reached a conclusion that I believe you already know is accurate. I believe that you killed her, not in anger or in a moment of passion, but in the carefully planned execution of someone you believed was a threat to your sister. Is that correct?" Thomas's face went white. He did not deny it. "Eleanor discovered something," continued Miss Marple, "about Margaret's past, not the affair with Robert Ashford. That was a small thing, and you would not have killed to protect her from that revelation. but something else. Something that Margaret has been hiding. Something that would cause her genuine harm if it were revealed. What was that secret, Mr. Ashford? For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, in a whisper, he spoke. Margaret was pregnant, he said, 7 years ago, when she was with Robert. She was pregnant. David arranged for her to have the pregnancy terminated, not legally, not safely. It was arranged quietly, through a contact that David had. The woman who performed the procedure was not a qualified doctor. And the procedure went wrong. Margaret nearly died. She was left unable to have children. Miss Marple absorbed this information with the patience of someone who had heard many terrible things in her long life. And Eleanor discovered this, she said. Eleanor found medical records, said Thomas. She had contacts, somehow, in hospitals in the nearby towns. She discovered that Margaret had been admitted for an emergency procedure that was euphemistically described as a spontaneous miscarriage, but which was actually something else. And when Eleanor threatened to reveal this, when she threatened to tell me, to tell my parents, to tell everyone that David had endangered Margaret's life for the sake of his pride and his desire to protect Robert, I couldn't allow it. So you killed her, said Miss Marple. I took one of her candlesticks, said Thomas. I visited her that evening. I told her I wanted to negotiate on behalf of my sister. She agreed to meet me in the darkness, by the trees. And when we were alone, when she was not expecting violence, I hit her. I took the candlestick, and I hit her until she stopped moving. And then I took the candlestick with me, and I threw it in the river, where I knew it would be carried away by the current. And David Sutherland took the blame, said Miss Marple thoughtfully. He allowed himself to be arrested, knowing that his arrest would bury the secret of Margaret's past, the secret of his own dangerous decision 7 years ago. He sacrificed himself to protect both his wife and his brother-in-law. Yes, said Thomas, tears now flowing down his young face. He knew. I don't know how, but David knew. When the police arrested him, he looked at me with such sadness, such understanding. He knew I had done it, and he let them take him. The confession of Thomas Ashford came as a shock to the village, but not in the way one might expect. Rather than vindicating David Sutherland, it seemed to compound the tragedy, rather than relieve it. Thomas Ashford was a respected member of the community, a young man with a promising future. The revelation that he was Eleanor's killer shattered the certainty with which the village had accepted David's guilt. Inspector Craddock, presented with the evidence of Thomas's guilt, released David immediately. But the relief this might have brought was tempered by the understanding of what lay beneath the crime. Eleanor Fairfax had not simply been blackmailing people, she had been systematically exploiting the traumas and secrets of a community. And her death, while certainly criminal, emerged from a desperation that was almost understandable. The question, said the inspector to Miss Marple on December 29th, as they sat in his temporary office, is whether the CPS will pursue a charge of murder, or if they might consider this manslaughter based on provocation. A young man acting to protect his sister from the destruction of everything she had rebuilt. A jury might show some sympathy. That may depend, said Miss Marple, on whether the full story becomes public knowledge. If the circumstances, Margaret's past, the dangerous procedure, David's role in it, are revealed, then public sympathy might indeed extend to Thomas. But if the story is presented simply as a young man murdering a woman because she was blackmailing his family, then the perception will be very different. justice rarely has room for nuance," said the inspector bitterly. But Miss Marple's mind was not entirely focused on Thomas Ashford's future or the legal implications of his confession. Rather, her attention had turned to another question entirely, one that had been nagging at the periphery of her awareness throughout the investigation. Why had David Sutherland been so ready to confess to a crime he did not commit? His sacrifice suggested more than simple love for his wife or sense of familial obligation. It suggested a man who was already carrying a burden of guilt so heavy that additional guilt seemed almost inconsequential. And Margaret's relief at David's arrest, that had seemed significant in a different way. What if Margaret had known something she had not revealed? What if her knowledge extended beyond simple knowledge of Thomas's guilt to something deeper? On December 30th, Miss Marple arranged to meet Margaret Sutherland once more. This time, the conversation took place not in Margaret's home, but in Miss Marple's cottage, and it was initiated not by Miss Marple, but by Margaret herself. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said, seated in the same chair James Willoughby had occupied. "I've been thinking about it constantly since Thomas's arrest, and I believe I owe you the complete truth." "Then tell me," said Miss Marple gently. "When David told me he was going to the market that afternoon," said Margaret slowly, "I knew he was planning to speak with Eleanor, and I knew that whatever Eleanor revealed would be terrible. So I followed him. I left the house a few minutes after he did, and I walked to the market, staying out of sight. I wanted to see Eleanor face to face, to speak with her myself if David did not." "And did you?" asked Miss Marple. "I did not," said Margaret, "because I arrived at the market and saw David speaking with Eleanor, and I saw his face when she revealed her information to him. And I understood in that moment that the secret she was revealing had to do with something he had been hiding from me. Something beyond simply protecting Robert. So I returned home. But you did not tell the police this," said Miss Marple. "You did not tell them that you had followed your husband to the market." "No," said Margaret, "because I was ashamed, and because I feared that if I revealed that I had been at the market, I might become a suspect myself. Eleanor had discovered something about my past, something that David had hidden from me. I didn't want to explain it to the police." "What had Eleanor discovered?" asked Miss Marple. Margaret took a breath. She had discovered that the man I was involved with 7 years ago, Robert Ashford, had not simply left the village. He had been forced to leave by David. And the way David had forced him to leave was not through simple conversation or moral persuasion. David had threatened Robert with physical violence. David had told Robert that if he did not leave immediately, David would destroy him, would reveal secrets about Robert that would ruin his life. I didn't know any of this until Eleanor told David, and David came home looking like a broken man. "And what secrets did David know about Robert?" asked Miss Marple. "I don't know," said Margaret. "David has not told me, but I suspect they relate to something criminal, something that would have resulted in Robert's arrest or serious legal consequences. David, you see, had discovered something about Robert's involvement in— I believe it was connected to a theft. A significant theft from the Ashford family business years before." Miss Marple's mind clicked another piece into place. This explained why David had been so adamant about keeping the secret. It was not simply about protecting Margaret from embarrassment or heartbreak. It was about protecting Robert from the legal consequences of a crime, a protection that had been purchased through David's own threat and coercion. "So David was a blackmailer himself," said Miss Marple, not as a question but as a statement of understanding. "In a sense," said Margaret. though he did it for what he believed were good reasons. He was protecting me from an unsuitable match by removing the unsuitable party. He was protecting Robert from his own mistakes by forcing him to start fresh elsewhere. He was protecting the Ashford family from the shame of having a thief in their midst. But yes, he was using blackmail to achieve these ends. And Eleanor discovered this and threatened to reveal it, said Miss Marple. Eleanor threatened everything, said Margaret bitterly. She threatened to tell me that David had forced Robert away by blackmail. She threatened to tell Robert's family what David knew about Robert's past. She threatened to expose David as a hypocrite, a man who was using extortion to control others, while he himself was guilty of embezzlement years earlier in his own career. Eleanor had discovered that David, before he came to St. Mary Mead, had been involved in a complex financial fraud. He had been caught, but had escaped prosecution by using his legal knowledge to negotiate a settlement that involved him leaving his position and his profession. So David and Eleanor were locked in a complex dance, said Miss Marple. Eleanor knew his secrets, David knew hers. And when Eleanor began to exploit the secrets of other villagers, David must have wondered when Eleanor would turn her attention to using his own secrets against him. Exactly, said Margaret. And when Eleanor did finally confront him with her knowledge, when she told him that she was going to reveal that he had blackmailed Robert into leaving, that he had hidden criminal activity in his past, that he was a fundamentally dishonest man, David broke. He came home that day prepared to confess everything to me, prepared to face the consequences of his actions, prepared perhaps to even take his own life, rather than allow the shame to continue. But Thomas killed Eleanor before David could act, said Miss Marple. Yes, said Margaret. And when I realized what Thomas had done, when I understood that my brother had committed murder to protect me, to protect the secret of my dangerous procedure, and David's role in arranging it, I also understood that I could not allow David to be punished for a crime he did not commit. So I encouraged him to remain silent, to take responsibility even though he was innocent, because I knew that if the truth about Thomas came out, it would destroy him far more completely than any legal punishment could. And when David was arrested, you were relieved, said Miss Marple, not because your husband was guilty, but because his arrest meant that all of the secrets, yours, David's, Thomas's, Robert's, would be buried under the weight of his presumed guilt. Yes, said Margaret, her voice barely above a whisper. And I am ashamed of that relief, Miss Marple. I am ashamed that I was willing to allow my innocent husband to suffer for crimes he did not commit, simply to protect myself and my family from exposure. Miss Marple sat quietly for a long moment, absorbing the full complexity of what Margaret had revealed. This case was far more intricate than the simple murder of a blackmailer. It was a tangled web of deception, protection, and moral compromise, each person sacrificing themselves or others in an attempt to preserve some essential truth or protect some essential relationship. The question now, said Miss Marple, is what will happen when the full truth is revealed. When everyone understands that David was willing to sacrifice himself for others, when they understand the role that Eleanor's blackmail played in driving Thomas to violence, when they understand the long history of secrets and moral compromises that had accumulated in this village. I don't know, said Margaret, but I suspect that the legal system will not prove as understanding as we might hope, and I fear that the village itself will fracture under the weight of these revelations. On December 31st, New Year's Eve, Miss Marple made a decision that surprised everyone who knew her. She requested a meeting with Thomas Ashford, with David and Margaret Sutherland, with James Willoughby, and with Inspector Craddock, in the study of her cottage. When questioned about the purpose of this meeting, she was evasive, merely noting that she believed she had made a discovery that would affect the disposition of Thomas's case. They gathered on the final evening of the year, a strange assembly of the guilty and the innocent, the revealed and the concealed. Outside, the village rang with the preparations for celebration, but inside Miss Marple's cottage there was only tension and uncertainty. Miss Marple served tea and small cakes, a gesture so domestically normal that it seemed almost absurd in the context of why they had gathered. Then, with the deliberateness of a woman making a performance, she rose and walked to her small library. "I have been conducting my own investigation," she said, removing a leather-bound volume from the shelf, "into the matter of Eleanor Fairfax's death and the circumstances that led to it. And I have discovered something that I believe changes the nature of this entire case." She opened the book to a marked page, not a case file or evidence record, but the memoirs of a London detective from the 1920s. She read aloud a passage about the psychology of violent crime, about how murderers often carry their guilt in their body language and their patterns of behavior, and about how the most reliable indicator of guilt is not external evidence, but the internal knowledge of having committed a terrible act. "The reason I am reading you this passage," said Miss Marple, "is because I wish to speak about something that has been troubling me since the very beginning of this investigation. And that is the question of motive and character. We have established that Thomas Ashford killed Eleanor Fairfax, but what has not been fully examined is why he killed her, and whether his killing was truly an act of murder or something more complex." Thomas, sitting rigidly in a chair, seemed to struggle to breathe. "Thomas Ashford did not kill Eleanor Fairfax because she was a criminal," continued Miss Marple. "He did not kill her because she was blackmailing his family or threatening his sister's reputation. Rather, Thomas Ashford killed Eleanor Fairfax because she had discovered a truth about his sister that his sister had been hiding from her husband, and because Thomas, in his youth and his love for his sister, believed that this truth being revealed would cause unendurable pain." "But what was that truth?" asked Inspector Craddock, who had followed Miss Marple's reasoning but remained unclear about its precise nature. "The truth," said Miss Marple, turning to face the assembled group, "was that Margaret Sutherland did not simply have an affair with Robert Ashford. She became pregnant with his child. And rather than allow David to know of her infidelity, rather than face the consequences of her actions, Margaret allowed David to arrange a dangerous and illegal procedure to terminate that pregnancy. A procedure that nearly killed her, and that left her unable to bear children." There was a stunned silence at this revelation. "But that is what I already knew," said Margaret, her voice trembling. "That is the secret I have been carrying for 7 years. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "But what you did not know, and what Eleanor discovered, and what prompted Thomas to commit murder, was something more. Eleanor discovered that Margaret's pregnancy was not the result of a consensual affair. Eleanor discovered that Robert Ashford had taken Margaret against her will." The room seemed to freeze at these words. "That is the secret," said Miss Marple quietly. "That is the violation that Eleanor threatened to reveal. Not an affair, but an assault. A crime that Robert Ashford had committed against David's wife, years before David's marriage to Margaret." Margaret's face had gone completely white. "How did you discover this?" asked James Willoughby, his own face pale with the implications. "I did not discover it directly," said Miss Marple. "Rather, I observed a series of reactions that suggested it. When I spoke with Margaret about the secret Eleanor had discovered, she could not fully articulate what the secret was. She spoke around it, through it, but never directly at it. When I spoke with Thomas, the guilt in his face was not the guilt of someone who had killed to protect a family scandal. It was the guilt of someone who had committed an act of violence to prevent an even greater violence from being acknowledged. But why would acknowledging what Robert did to Margaret be so terrible? Asked the inspector. It would be the truth. It would be justice. Because, said Miss Marple, acknowledging what Robert did would mean acknowledging that Margaret is a victim. And Margaret, having survived that victimization, had chosen to reconstruct her life and her identity in a way that did not center on victimhood. Eleanor's threat to reveal what had happened was, in Margaret's mind, a threat to destroy the woman she had rebuilt herself to be. Margaret was crying now, silently, tears streaming down her face. And Thomas understood this, continued Miss Marple. Thomas understood that his sister, having survived a terrible assault, having chosen to move forward and build a life with David, having chosen to reclaim agency and power from a situation in which she had been completely powerless, was now being threatened with exposure by a woman who did not care about Margaret's recovery or Margaret's future, only about the profit to be gained from Margaret's shame. So Thomas killed Eleanor to protect his sister's rebuilt life, said the inspector slowly. Thomas killed Eleanor, said Miss Marple, because he believed that preserving his sister's chosen identity was worth more than preserving Eleanor's life. Whether that is true or not is a question for God, and for courts, and for the conscience of the village, but it is not, I would suggest, a question that has a simple answer. There was a long silence as the implications of this truth settled over the group. There is, however, said Miss Marple, another matter that I believe requires attention. And that concerns the role that David Sutherland played in this entire tragedy. All eyes turned toward David. David Sutherland, said Miss Marple, knew that Margaret had been assaulted by Robert Ashford. He knew this years ago, before he married her. He knew that the pregnancy she had become pregnant with was the result of that assault. And instead of ensuring that Robert Ashford faced justice for his crime, instead of supporting Margaret through the trauma of both the assault and the pregnancy, David chose to handle the situation privately. He arranged for Margaret to have the dangerous procedure. He forced Robert to leave the village. And he made Margaret complicit in his decision to bury the crime. I had her consent, said David, his voice rough with pain. I did not force Margaret to do anything against her will. I asked her what she wanted, and she told me she wanted to forget, to move forward, to not have the assault define her life. I'm sure that is true, said Miss Marple gently. But by doing so, you denied Margaret the opportunity to heal through truth. You denied her the agency to report what had been done to her. And you allowed Robert Ashford to escape justice for a serious crime. In your desire to protect Margaret, David, you denied her the capacity to protect herself. So now I am guilty? Asked David bitterly. I am guilty of trying to help my wife. You are guilty of a more subtle crime, said Miss Marple. You are guilty of controlling a trauma victim in the name of protection. You are guilty of making decisions about Margaret's violation on her behalf. And you are guilty of allowing a violent man to go free who might commit similar crimes against other women. The weight of this accusation hung in the air. Which brings me, said Miss Marple, to the reason I have called you all here this evening. I believe that this case, as tragic as it is, offers the village an opportunity an opportunity to acknowledge not only the crimes that have been committed, but the systemic failures that allowed Eleanor Fairfax to prey upon the vulnerable. Eleanor was able to exploit the secrets of this village, because the village itself had constructed a system in which secrets were more valued than truth, in which reputation was more important than justice, in which protection from shame was prioritized over protection of the vulnerable. "What exactly are you suggesting?" asked the inspector. "I am suggesting," said Miss Marple, "that the full truth of this case, all of it, including what was done to Margaret, including David's role in concealing it, including the conditions that allowed Eleanor to acquire such destructive power, I am suggesting that this truth should be made known to the village, not as gossip, not as scandal, but as a lesson. A lesson about the dangers of silence, about the power of truth, and about the responsibility we all have to protect one another." "That is asking too much," said James Willoughby. "That would destroy people. It would destroy families." "It would," agreed Miss Marple. "But would not the destruction of truth be a greater tragedy than the temporary discomfort of revelation?" "The village is not ready for such truth," said the inspector. "The village will judge and condemn, and the damage will be far more lasting than any temporary scandal." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, "but I believe that the village must have the opportunity to choose. The opportunity to decide whether the protection of reputation is truly more important than the protection of victims. And I do not believe we have the right to make that choice on behalf of others." New Year's Day arrived with the kind of clear, cold beauty that seems to mock human suffering. The village of St. Mary Mead was preparing to ring in a new year, but the preparations were subdued, shadowed by the knowledge of Eleanor's death and the arrest of Thomas Ashford. What the village did not yet know was that everything they believed they understood about the crime was about to be undermined by a truth so complete, so comprehensive, that it would alter the entire moral landscape of the community. Miss Marple had done something that evening, something that in the opinion of some was beyond her right to do, and in the opinion of others was an act of moral necessity. She had written a letter, a long, detailed, meticulously researched letter that she had sent to every household in St. Mary Mead, to be delivered on New Year's morning. The letter did not merely recount the facts of Eleanor Fairfax's death. It told the complete story, layer by layer, secret by secret, beginning with Eleanor's arrival in the village and concluding with the psychological forces that had driven Thomas Ashford to murder. The letter detailed what Eleanor had done to James Willoughby, threatening to contact his son and creating psychological turmoil. It described what Eleanor had learned about David Sutherland's financial crimes of decades past, and how David had used blackmail himself to control others and hide crimes. It revealed what had been done to Margaret Sutherland by Robert Ashford, and how the assault had been concealed, buried, denied the justice it deserved. And it explained, with a clarity that could not be misinterpreted, why Thomas Ashford had killed Eleanor Fairfax, not out of mere love for his sister, but out of a desperate attempt to prevent his sister's trauma from being weaponized by a predatory woman who viewed human suffering as a commodity to be bought and sold. The village's reaction was swift and multifaceted. Some people were shocked, some were angry, some were ashamed, and some, perhaps most importantly, were forced to confront truths about themselves and their community that they had been carefully avoiding for years. The vicar preached a sermon on the power of forgiveness, but his words rang hollow to those who had been victimized by the very culture of silence that had allowed Eleanor to flourish. The doctor's wife, Catherine Ashford, made a public statement about the importance of mental health resources and the dangers of stress in the community, carefully positioned to suggest that Eleanor's death had been a tragedy and that the village should focus on healing rather than judgment. But her statement found little resonance among those who had heard the full truth of Eleanor's predations. It was David Sutherland who took the most remarkable action. On January 2nd, he went to the police and made a full confession, not of murder, but of the crimes he had concealed for years. He confessed to his role in arranging Margaret's procedure. He confessed to the blackmail he had used to force Robert Ashford to leave the village. He confessed to the financial improprieties of his earlier career, and he made a formal statement urging that Margaret receive whatever support and counselling she required to fully process what had been done to her. "I have spent my life," he said in his statement, "attempting to control the consequences of others' actions and my own guilt. In doing so, I have prevented the people I love from being able to heal authentically. I do not deserve forgiveness for this, but I believe the village deserves the truth." The police, faced with multiple confessions and a community in moral uproar, decided that the most just course of action was to allow the legal system to proceed in a measured way. Thomas Ashford would face trial for Eleanor's murder. But the circumstances, the provocation, the noble intent, the complex family dynamics would be presented to a jury that would now understand the full context. It was on January 5th, at Miss Marple's invitation, that David Sutherland came to her cottage to speak with her privately. "I want to thank you," he said simply, "for having the courage to tell the truth. It would have been easier to let me take the blame, to let the village believe what it wanted to believe. But instead, you forced us all to confront ourselves. I am not certain that gratitude is the appropriate response," said Miss Marple, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "What I did was not kind. It was necessary, but it was not kind. The village will spend years processing the truth I forced upon them, and you will spend the rest of your life attempting to make amends for decisions that can never be truly amended." "Yes," agreed David, "but at least it will be done consciously. At least Margaret will know that she does not have to carry her trauma in silence. At least Robert will have the opportunity to face justice, or forgiveness, or whatever is appropriate. And at least Thomas's act, while still a crime, will be understood in the context of a community that has failed to protect its most vulnerable." "That is a generous interpretation," said Miss Marple, "but I fear you are more optimistic about human nature than I am. The village will not suddenly become a place of healing and truth. Rather, it will become a place of division, where some will insist that the truth should never have been revealed, and others will use the truth as a weapon against their enemies." "Nevertheless," said David, "at least we will know the truth. And that is something that Eleanor denied us for as long as she was alive." On January 10th, Thomas Ashford went to trial. The trial lasted 2 weeks, and the evidence presented was complex and emotionally charged. The prosecution argued that murder is murder, regardless of motive. The defense argued that Thomas's actions, while technically criminal, were understandable in the context of trying to protect his sister from ongoing psychological harm. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict, when it came, was guilty of manslaughter rather than murder. The judge, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of the case, sentenced Thomas to 5 years imprisonment, with a recommendation that he be considered for parole after 3 years, depending on his behavior and rehabilitation. It was not justice precisely. Justice, Miss Marple understood, required restoration and healing, neither of which was possible in this case. But it was something between judgment and mercy, a sentence that acknowledged the wrong that had been done without entirely destroying the young man who had done it. The months following the trial were the most difficult in St. Mary Mead's modern history. The revelation of Eleanor's crimes, combined with the revelation of David's moral failures and the trauma that Margaret had endured, created a profound rupture in the village's collective understanding of itself. The place that had seemed like a peaceful, innocent English village was revealed to be far more complex, far more troubled, far more shadowed by secrets than anyone had imagined. Some residents chose to leave. The Ashfords, the parents of Thomas and Margaret, found the village too painful and relocated to the coast, where they could attempt to rebuild some sense of family unity away from the constant reminders of what had happened. James Willoughby considered leaving as well, but ultimately decided to stay, continuing his practice but with newfound humility about his own capacity for error and rationalization. Margaret Sutherland, freed from the necessity of maintaining her carefully constructed facade of normalcy, began the difficult work of therapy and genuine healing. She recorded her story with the help of a local journalist and published it in a small magazine focused on the issue of sexual assault and victim recovery. Her willingness to speak publicly about what had happened to her gave voice to other victims in the community who had previously suffered in silence. Robert Ashford was, in the end, not prosecuted for the assault on Margaret. This was partly because the statute of limitations had nearly passed, partly because the focus on Eleanor's crimes had shifted attention away from that older violation, and partly because Margaret herself had asked that he not be pursued. She told Miss Marple that she had no desire to drag the Ashford family through additional trauma, and that she had found a way to accept what had happened without requiring external validation of her pain. I spent 7 years allowing that assault to define my life in ways I was not fully aware of, Margaret explained. Every decision I made, every way I related to David, was colored by the trauma I had experienced. And in trying to hide that trauma, I allowed it to control me even more completely. But now that I have acknowledged it, now that it has been brought into the light, I find that it has lost some of its power. I can remember what happened without allowing it to determine who I will be going forward. Miss Marple, observing this transformation, experienced a sense of satisfaction that transcended the usual satisfaction of having solved a mystery. She had been instrumental in bringing truth to light, yes, but the greater truth was that truth alone was not healing. Truth was merely the foundation upon which healing could be built. If people were willing to do the difficult work of processing and accepting what had been revealed. In the spring, about 4 months after Eleanor's death, Miss Marple was invited to a small gathering at the vicarage. The vicar, Reverend Hartley, had decided that the village should have a moment of collective reflection on what had transpired, not in judgment, but in recognition of the complexity of human nature and the importance of community support. At that gathering, several people spoke. James Willoughby spoke about the dangers of carrying shame in silence and about how his own fear of exposure had made him vulnerable to Eleanor's blackmail. David Sutherland spoke about the dangers of trying to protect people from truth, and about how his attempts to shield Margaret from the knowledge of what had happened had actually prevented her from healing. And Margaret herself spoke, moving many in the room to tears, about the journey from victimhood to survivorship, and about the importance of having her trauma acknowledged and validated. "I want to thank Miss Marple," Margaret said at the end of her remarks, "for having the courage to tell the truth about what happened in this village. It would have been easier to let the matter rest, to allow my brother to go to prison for protecting me, to allow my husband's guilt to overshadow his attempts to help me. But instead, Miss Marple insisted that the complete truth be told, and in telling that truth, she gave me the gift of being able to speak my own truth." Miss Marple, seated in the back of the vicarage hall, felt a profound sense of humility at these words. She had not set out to be a healer. She had set out, as she always did, to discern the truth. But in doing so, in insisting that the truth be told and understood in its complete complexity, she had created space for healing to occur. On a warm April afternoon, nearly 5 months after Eleanor Fairfax's death, Miss Marple received a visitor at her cottage. It was Thomas Ashford, released from prison after serving his sentence awaiting trial. A sentence that had been suspended pending his actual imprisonment, which would not begin until after he had exhausted his appeals. He was much changed from the terrified young man who had confessed to the murder. He was more composed, more thoughtful, carrying himself with a seriousness that spoke to a maturing of his character, forged in the crucible of legal process and public exposure. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for what you did, for forcing the truth about Eleanor into the open. Because if you had not done that, if I had been convicted of murder in the context of a simple crime of passion over family honor, I would have spent my entire life understanding myself as a monster. But instead, I now understand myself as a young man who made a terrible choice to protect his sister. A choice that was wrong, but understandable. I am not certain that understanding makes the choice less wrong," said Miss Marple, serving him tea with the same domesticity she served all her visitors. "Perhaps not," agreed Thomas, "but it allows me to move forward. It allows me to live with what I have done, to accept that I am capable of violence, and to commit myself to ensuring that I never act violently again." "And your sister?" asked Miss Marple. "How does she fare?" "Margaret is recovering," said Thomas. "She and David are seeing a couples therapist. They are working through the trauma that my action caused them, which is not to say that my action was justified, merely that its consequences are not only destructive. There is a possibility that out of this tragedy there can be growth. That is all one can hope for," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "Not that tragedy can be prevented, it is part of human existence and cannot be avoided. But that tragedy can be the catalyst for change, for growth, for a deeper understanding of ourselves and of one another." After Thomas left, Miss Marple sat in her garden, watching the spring light fall through the branches of the flowering cherry tree. Her mind was turning, as it often did, to the nature of justice and the role that she had played in this recent drama. She thought about Eleanor Fairfax, dead at a time when she was causing maximum harm. She thought about the secrets that Eleanor had carried, the knowledge that had been weaponized. She thought about Thomas Ashford, whose act of murder was also, in a profound sense, an act of love. She thought about David Sutherland, whose attempts to protect others had caused the harm they were meant to prevent. And she thought about Margaret, whose trauma had shaped her life in ways she had not fully understood until that trauma was brought into the light. What emerged from these reflections was not a sense that justice had been served. The legal system's response was merely legal, not truly just. Rather, what emerged was an understanding that justice is not a state that can be achieved through the conviction of the guilty. Justice is a process, an ongoing endeavor to create communities where the vulnerable are protected, where truth is valued over reputation, where people are supported in healing from trauma rather than required to bury it. The village of St. Mary Mead would never be the same as it had been before Eleanor Fairfax's arrival. The comfortable assumptions, the carefully maintained facades, the unspoken agreements to keep secrets for the sake of community harmony, all of these had been stripped away. In their place, something new was beginning to grow. A community that was learning, slowly and painfully, to value truth over comfort, and healing over the preservation of reputation. "It is a good thing," Miss Marple murmured to herself, watching the light play through the cherry blossoms, "that we are not required to solve all of humanity's problems. We are only required to see them clearly, and to do what we can to help others see them as well." 1 year later, December arrived again, bringing with it the Christmas season that had been so marred by Eleanor's death. The village of St. Mary Mead, having spent months processing the revelations that had emerged from the murder investigation, had begun the slow work of rebuilding. Thomas Ashford, released from prison after serving his full sentence, was working at a neighbouring village, slowly rebuilding his reputation and his sense of self-worth. He had become involved in a support group for young people who had experienced the legal system, and his work was beginning to have an impact on his own healing and growth. Margaret and David Sutherland had chosen to remain in the village, though their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the revelations. They were working together with genuine honesty for the first time, no longer bound by the necessity of hiding traumatic truths. Their marriage was stronger for having been broken and rebuilt on a foundation of truth rather than constructed on the fragile facade of pretense. James Willoughby had made significant changes to his practice, implementing stronger financial controls and working with a therapist to process his own shame and self-deception. His practice was thriving, and he had become something of an advocate for ethical business practices in the legal community. The Christmas market returned to St. Mary Mead, though notably changed. There was no stall called the Corner of Christmas Wishes, no consultant offering to listen to people's troubles in exchange for money. Instead, the vicar had established a community support service, offering free counselling and assistance to anyone in the village who needed help processing trauma or working through difficult circumstances. It was on the evening of December 21st, exactly 1 year after Eleanor's death, that Miss Marple found herself once again seated at a tea stall in the Christmas market. She was older now, more visibly frail, and yet her eyes seemed to contain even more of the accumulated wisdom of her long life. A young woman approached her, a stranger to the village, visiting for the holidays. She asked Miss Marple if the seat across from her was available, and Miss Marple gestured for her to sit. "This is a lovely village," the young woman said, sipping her tea. "Peaceful, quiet, the sort of place where nothing bad ever happens." Miss Marple smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that contained within it the understanding of all of the things that had happened, all the secrets that had been hidden, all the pain that had been silently endured. "On the contrary," she said gently, "I suspect that very terrible things have happened here, as they happen everywhere. The difference is that the people of this village are beginning to acknowledge those terrible things, to speak about them, to seek healing. And that, I believe, is a form of grace." The young woman looked at her curiously, perhaps sensing that there was more to this story than she could perceive, more to this peaceful village than met the eye. "Have you lived here long?" the young woman asked. "Most of my life," said Miss Marple. "Long enough to have observed the extraordinary complexity of ordinary human nature. Long enough to understand that evil and goodness rarely present themselves in pure form. Long enough to know that the village that seems peaceful on the surface is often the one hiding the deepest secrets." "That sounds rather sad," said the young woman. "Perhaps it is," agreed Miss Marple, "but it is also rather true. And I have found that truth, however sad, is preferable to the most comfortable of lies." As the evening deepened and the Christmas lights began to twinkle against the darkness, Miss Marple sat with her tea, watching the people of St. Mary Mead go about their preparations for the holiday. They were not a perfect people. They had not been healed of all their wounds by the revelation of truth. But they were a people who were beginning to understand themselves better, who were beginning to live with greater honesty, who were beginning to build a community based on something stronger than the maintenance of secrets. And as Miss Marple observed them, she reflected, as she had reflected countless times before, on the nature of her own role in their lives. She was not a detective in any official sense. She was simply an old woman who had lived long enough to see the patterns in human behavior, who had the patience to listen carefully, and who had the courage to speak truth, even when that truth was painful. The mystery of Eleanor Fairfax's death had been solved. The killer had been identified and sentenced. The secrets that Eleanor had held had been brought into the light. But the true mystery, the mystery of how human beings could do so much harm, and yet retain the capacity to heal and grow, that mystery remained unsolved. As it would for the rest of Miss Marple's life, and perhaps beyond. "Merry Christmas," said the young woman, rising to leave as the evening grew late. "Merry Christmas," replied Miss Marple, "and may you find truth wherever it leads you, however difficult that journey might be." The young woman smiled, perhaps not fully understanding what Miss Marple meant, but sensing that there was something important in those words. And as she walked away into the Christmas night, Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting needles clicking steadily in her lap, watching the lights of the village shimmer in the darkness, and reflecting on the complexity of justice, the power of truth, and the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. Outside, in the cold December air, the church bells began to ring for the Christmas season, and in the heart of St. Mary Mead, a village that was no longer quite as innocent as it had seemed, but was perhaps more honest, more compassionate, and more whole than it had ever been before. Christmas lights twinkled with a light that seemed to promise not comfort and easy answers, but truth, healing, and the possibility of transformation.